So I'm joined by Paul, who is CISO extraordinaire and now with the ISF doing some great things there. And we're going to talk a little bit about third-party risk. So is this something you've really seen increase over the past few years, or has it always been kind of there and no one had taken any notice?
I think it's always been there. I think we've kind of hit a bit of a watershed moment. So organisations are realising that the totality of their risk exposure is the sum of all of its parts. And that extends into the supply chain, into third parties. Equally, I think the challenges of the pandemic have also shown the fragility of some organisations' processes where there is a strong dependency to a third party. So it's really started to shine a lens on what's happening beyond the four walls of an organisation, in isolation. So I think it is now really starting to get some attention, and for all the right reasons.
Is it a sign of maturity as well, that actually some organisations, they're doing okay, they're doing better on their own security than maybe we were 10 years ago, and now it's time to look at our supply chain?
Well, look, I mean, it has to be celebrated that organisations are now putting cyber as an exec level consideration and concern, and the funding and the resourcing is being pumped into cybersecurity. That doesn't mean that we've still got a lot to do, because we still have a lot to do. So that's good, but I think looking at the challenge of a third-party risk and then looking at some of the clear and present dangers. So everybody will recall what happened with SolarWinds recently. You recognise that actually you're not in complete control. So shoring up your own internal security posture is only part of the problem now. So we now have to look at where we go next with that and how we start to augment and take our suppliers on the same journey that we take our own organisations on.
And one of the things that we hear a lot is that actually getting buy-in from the business is a really big challenge for this risk, as it has been, I think, with all cyber risks over the years. Like, how would you advise people do that? I know you've had your own challenges there too.
Yeah, it's the problem that you have, and that we are slowly getting over, is security equals friction. Organisations are being asked to be more agile, innovative, and move a lot quicker than they have in the past, and they need to do that in order to survive. So the last thing that a business leader wants to hear is, you've got to jump through these hoops before you can sign off on that supplier or that third party, and so on and so forth. The whole ethos of business engagement with security teams and that mentality of shifting left is where it's paying dividends now. And actually what's happening is business is starting to realise that risk starts and stops with them. It isn't something that you outsource. So if you introduce a supplier into a critical business process and you don't understand the ramifications of that, the resiliency or the risk posture of that third party, and something happens, be that a cyber event, a data loss event, or a business disruption or continuous event because of the stability of the third party, it's on them. And the question that needs to come from security leaders is, look, it is what it is. How can I help? And how can I help you have the confidence that you're doing the right thing with your third parties, and that you have that proportionality? It doesn't mean that you can't do business with that third party, but if there are limitations to their ability to protect your information, you need to understand what they are so that you can compensate within the processes or the interactions that you have with them. And in some cases, you do have to accept that that's not the supplier for you. But it just comes down to that conversation.
Now, you raised something really interesting to me there, so like around continuity. So for a long while, I've heard business continuity people say, actually, cyber is a business continuity issue. And it does feel like in the last year and a half, we've maybe moved in that direction. Is that something you've seen with all security, I guess, not just third-party risk?
Yeah, I think what I would say with that, Carla, is we're moving away from the world of cybersecurity, and we're starting to think about it in the context of business resiliency. So it's now not about trying to prepare yourself such that a continuous event will not happen. We've just demonstrated that we're not in control of our lives, because Mr. COVID came along, or Mrs. COVID came along and made everybody's lives hell. And we did what we could to prepare for that. We did all sorts of work supposedly after swine flu and avian flu, but it wasn't good enough. So it's actually about resiliency. It's about accepting the fact that something is going to happen at some point, and your ability to fulfill your objectives and obligations will be challenged. How do you detect that that circumstance has happened as quickly as you can? And how do you look at your availability and recoverability of critical and non-critical business processes so that you can recover and get back on a BAU footing as quickly as possible? And it becomes a USP. If you are the organization that can roll with the punches and get back on your feet really, really quickly, you're going to have an edge on your competitors, aren't you? I mean, what's not to like about that?
Now, I've done a lot of work across cyber business continuity, risk in general. And while I hear some people talking about this, what I hear more is those silos still existing. Do you think we really are moving there, or do you think it's just some organizations? And maybe that's okay. Maybe from what you've just said, actually some organizations get that USP and that win, and some don't. Where do you think we're going?
Do you know what? I mean, every organisation is different. The politics in organisations is different. The way, different countries and societies behave is very different. All of these things create physical and non-physical boundaries between functions and organisations and business processes. I think the key is to recognise that they're there, and you either embrace them or you knock them down. And that's the simple fact. I think it's a sweeping generalization to say that the siloed mentality exists everywhere. It just exists in different forms, and it's just being aware. And a lot of this is about just being situationally aware and being conscious of your surroundings and conscious of your limitations. Then and only then can you do something about it. If you live in that denial to say, well, we're not a siloed organisation and we're all harmonious, and that's not true. Well, you can't fix it if you're not accepting it's broken in the first place,
Now, third-party risk comes out sort of time and time again as one of the top risks that businesses are thinking about this year. But is that what you're seeing too, or do you think there are other risks that they need to focus on more?
Again, it comes down to the organisation. It comes down to organisations' appetite for risk. It comes down to the threat landscape that affects them. I think if you looked at it as a generalization, companies are now really starting to worry about supply chain risk for two reasons. One, they're seeing what's happening with things like SolarWinds and other organizations, and they're hearing the stories of supply chain disruption. They don't want that to happen to them. But two, and this is slightly more significant, is their clients and their customers are becoming more aware, and they're asking the substantive data, especially if they're a data processor, for example. And the question goes a little bit like this: how can I be sure that my data is safe in your hands? So actually what they're doing to try and assure their own supply chains is being done to them as well. So it's a bit of a double-edged thing. So they've got to recognize that. And again, as I said some moments, going in a slightly previous context, I think it becomes a USP if you can be really confident in your ability to be resilient and your ability to manage your risk in that totality. And you pass that confidence to your customer base, they're going to continue to do business with you. It is something that people, consumers do make decisions on now, certainly enterprise consumers, to whether to trade or not to trade, based on the amount of risk potentially introducing by working with you. So it's a win-win by looking down into your supply chain and out to your customer base to just understand your limitations and what you need to do. In answer to your other question, what other things are concerning? I think organizations now are really starting to look at their enterprise security architecture and thinking about whether they need to turn the model on its head and maybe look at things like zero trust architectures, just to limit the ability to move laterally around environments and infrastructures, because unfortunately the curse of ransomware is not going away anytime soon. The rates are going up. The campaign actors are becoming more innovative. You've gone from 26% of hit organizations paying ransoms to 32%. As long as people are paying, the industry is stimulated and the campaign actors will continue to come. So I think that's probably in, jostling for position with supply chain risk. And actually they're interconnected, because what happens if your supplier gets ransomed and you've got a B2B connection into your infrastructure, or they simply have an extinction level scenario where they can't come back and trade again, and you've then got to deal with that business disruption. It's it's almost scary how fragile and interlinked some of these risks are when you start to deconstruct them.
It is, and I think it's been really like brought to people's attention this year, you know, things like actually the Colonial pipeware attack. It's not just a cyber attack that someone dealt with, that had real world impacts to real people. And certainly I think people that aren't in our world started to realize how much of a problem it is and start to ask some really interesting questions of us. So I think it's yeah, that makes a difference, doesn't it, when your customers start to be affected.
It's really interesting, Carla, because you know, historically you've heard this mentality from certain campaign actors that, wow, we're just stinging enterprise, it's a victimless crime. But I think what Colonial has shown us is actually the societal impact of an extinction level attack, a ransomware attack, is never that far away. So, you know, although Colonial's information technology environment got hit, the duty of care, they had to protect that critical infrastructure, they had to shut it down. The petrol stations ran dry. It disrupted commerce in the United States because oil and gas couldn't move around. And that's a big story, and that hits everybody. And suddenly everybody's heads are raised and saying, well, what's going on? You know, these are the sorts of circumstances. And the more we start to see information and operational technology starting to converge, you know, there's every chance we may hit scenarios like that again and again and again.
Yeah, I think there really is, and it'll be really interesting to see, for me anyway, what the general population think and how they start to exert some pressure. You know, conversations I had where someone was saying to me, well, so we'll pay a ransom for data, but we don't pay a ransom for people. How does that make any sense? So I think those sort of conversations start driving political decisions, but we may be a little way off that.
Well, I mean, we've also seen the incidents. So the first. It's a bit of a loose connection, but we saw the first fatality linked to a ransomware attack. I think it was at a hospital in Düsseldorf. The hospital suffered a major outage, and a patient that was obviously in need of critical care. That care was disrupted, and sadly, ultimately, that patient lost their life. Now, you could argue that was a direct consequence of that ransomware attack. So the human impact of ransomware, it goes way beyond what the campaign actors are trying to do, which is let's target an enterprise, let's squeeze them for some cash and move on to the next victim, because it's a victimless crime which is hitting business. That's just not true.
Well, that seems like a good place to wrap things up. So thank you very much for coming and sharing some of your views with us.
You're very welcome. Always good to talk to you, Carla.
Thank you.